can monitor the chat as well, and if there are, obviously questions throughout, feel free to ask and stop us anytime, or we can certainly pick up questions at the end of each talk.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Jim. All right. So just in terms of disclosures, as I mentioned, I work at the Royal College, so I do receive payments for faculty development resources that I help develop, and for speaking about competence committees. When I think about really the three key pillars of CBD implementation, I think of three things, resident orientation and engagement. Oftentimes that's a missed component of CBD implementation. I think that's oftentimes because faculty development sort of overshadows the resident orientation. And then the third piece to the puzzle is really establishing a competence committee, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So in terms of outline, we're going to talk about the role, plural, of the competence committee, setting up your committee, and then going through your first meeting. So just really broad strokes, when we think of the competence committee, the goal is really to ensure that all residents achieve the requirements of the discipline. And so the competence committee's role is really to review and synthesize learner assessment data in order to make progress recommendations and guide learning activities. And here's a schematic of the competence committee within the larger program of assessment. And so here we have multiple assessments that support the program and curricular goals that have been sort of set at a national standard through the specialty committee meetings. And these assessments are intended to be continually collected in different contexts, using different methods by different assessors. And the primary purpose is really formative. It's really an opportunity to provide feedback and coach residents so that they can improve the care that they provide to patients. The secondary role of these assessments, of course, is more summative in nature, and that's where the data gets brought to the competence committee to make these high stakes decisions about progress and promotion. I think it is important to say right off the bat that the competence committee is a subcommittee of the RPC, or Residency Program Committee. And you may have noticed that I use the language that the competence committee makes recommendations. And the reason why it makes recommendations is because those recommendations need to be ratified by the RPC. So if we think about the differentiating roles of the competence committee versus the RPC, the competence committee is really focused on review of assessment data and determining progress. The RPC has a broader overview of the curriculum and training experiences. And so if we think about the tasks of the competence committee, that includes reviewing data, making decisions about individual EPA achievement, making recommendations, again, there's that word, about resident progress, and then advising on individual learner needs. The Residency Program Committee, as I mentioned, really sets the curriculum, is involved in program evaluation and review, and then ratifies the decisions of the Competence Committee, and is the committee that sort of actions any individualized learning plans that have been created. So with that understanding of the role of the Competence Committee, let's talk about how to get it set up. So step number one is to form your committee, and the size of your committee will really depend on the size of your program. So how many residents are in your program, as well as how many faculty you have to sort of draw from or to recruit from. Throughout the presentation, I put these little asterisks to indicate that these are sort of requirements from the Royal College. And so one of the requirements is that the Competence Committee have a minimum of 3 members. Typically, there'll be a chair. Oftentimes, the program director will sit on the committee, although it's recommended that the program director not be the Competence Committee chair, just from a conflicts of interest perspective. It's extremely helpful to have a program administrator sit on your Competence Committee. And we'll talk about the program administrator role later on in the presentation. And then the college recommends 1 clinical faculty for every 8 to 10 residents. And that's a rough estimate, and again, will largely depend on the size of your faculty from which you can recruit. The college also gives leeway in terms of deciding whether you want to include others. So some competence committees have included resident representatives. Others have included members who are external to the teaching faculty. So that might be a faculty related from a related discipline or subdiscipline. It may be a non-physician healthcare professional, and even members of the public. When selecting your members, I encourage you to select a diverse group. We know from Karen Hauer's work that diversity of experiences, skills, and opinions brings new perspectives to the Competence Committee, which can improve the quality of the decisions that the group makes. The other thing to think about is you want to recruit individuals who are educationally minded, those who are going to really serve as the CBD champions for your program. Just 2 days ago, Jim and I were on a call and we were talking about, the programs that oftentimes struggle are those who don't have a critical mass of CBD champions who can really push the implementation of CBD to their colleagues and to the residents. And the importance of choosing the right members is highlighted in this quote, which comes from the business world. It says, if you want to be successful in the long term within your organization, you need to have a team of people who believe and live the espoused philosophy. And so, we oftentimes talk about the tools, the techniques, and technology needed to implement CBD, and we talk a lot about Elentra and different platforms. But really what makes a committee function well is the individuals, the members, and whether they collectively understand their purpose and how the committee should function. So once you've selected your members, the next task is to create and share guiding documents. Again, from Karen Hauer's work, we know that structured systematic group procedures lead to better decisions. And so these 2 documents that you're going to create can help ensure that you've got a clear process for decision making. So the terms of reference, of course, include the role of the Competence Committee, the authority and responsibility, who the Competence Committee is under, so being the RPC, the membership, and of course, details about when meetings will occur. The process and procedures documents provides some guiding principles, outlines or defines what quorum will be, and most importantly, outlines how decisions will be made. And this is a requirement, again, from the college perspective, and accreditors will be looking to make sure that you have a documented approach to decision making. And so the college has nicely provided 2 templates for terms of reference and processes and procedures that you can modify for your own local context. And I encourage you to actually create these documents as a competence committee so that all members understand sort of the ins and outs of that process. And I also encourage you to share these documents with the relevant stakeholders within your department, in particular the residents, in the spirit of transparency. The Competence Committee is oftentimes perceived as a black box to residents. And so the more transparent about the processes that you can be, I think the greater the buy-in will be from residents. Okay, so the next step is to schedule your meetings. Again, the frequency will depend on the size of your program. As an example, in our program, we have 50 residents. We used to meet every other month. However, we found that our meetings were just going too long. We were in too many residents at each meeting, and so we've now moved to a monthly schedule. Again, the college requires that residents must be reviewed at least twice per year. So a couple of tips in terms of scheduling your meetings. Schedule your meetings relative to your RPC meetings. I mentioned earlier that decisions of the Competence Committee need to be ratified by the RPC. And so to ensure timely ratification, it's helpful to have your CC meeting, a week before your RPC, for example. Each specialty committee has very loosely defined the anticipated duration of each stage of training. And that information can be found in your training experiences document from the specialty committee. And it's helpful to look at that document and schedule your competence committee meetings relative to anticipated stage transitions, so that you're not sort of caught off guard when your residents say, hey, I think I'm ready to transition to the next stage, and you don't have a meeting scheduled for another 3 or 4 months, for example. And then lastly, try to plan your meetings 1 year in advance. This will help with member attendance so that they can slot that into their schedules in advance. Okay, step number 4 is to take an inventory of the assessment data. So just as a reminder, particularly in the Canadian context, it's not just about EPAs. I know there's a big emphasis on EPAs, and much of the specialty committee work, those 3 workshops that some of you may have been involved in, largely focused on EPAs, but the Competence Committee is really responsible for reviewing all of the assessment data that is generated for each resident. So this might include other workplace-based assessments, other simulation data. There's always tests of knowledge or in-training exams, progress testing such as OSCEs. There may be scholarly projects or other assessments that are involved. While you're taking an inventory of the assessment data that your program collects, it's also helpful to ensure that you've created what we call a curriculum map, which maps training experiences to assessments. So here's an example where we've outlined 2 to 3 EPAs for each off-service rotation, so that our residents, when they go off service, know which EPAs to focus on, which helps sort of elevate the educational value of their off-service rotations. And it helps them see it as, as training rather than just service. So that's something that you might consider doing. It's also helpful to map out the timeline of your assessments. So for example, when the in-training exams happen and when you tend to get the results for those in-training exams, so that you can ensure that you have the necessary data for the specific meetings in your annual schedule. Okay, step number 5 is to make assessment data accessible. So U of O right now is trying to make the transition away from 145 into Elentra. That transition hasn't fully happened yet, and so many programs will probably be juggling several platforms. In my program, we draw EPA data from Elentra. The remainder of our assessment data comes from 145, and then we house all documentation on Microsoft SharePoint. So we're working with different platforms, and it's important to make sure that your members have access and the right level of access. Because for 145 and Elentra, there are different types of access for example, the PD or the PA versus the Competence Committee members. I think it's worth talking just very briefly about data management systems. So in Ottawa, at least for EPAs, we use Elentra. And Elentra has really evolved, at least in Ottawa, since Jim and I started in 2018. We used to have to essentially open every single assessment form at our, in our pre-review individually, sort of as PDFs. And we now have this new data visualization platform, which provides us nice trends. It allows us to filter through the data very quickly and hover over a data point and get the narrative comments associated with that data point. And so if you haven't already provided your members training on how to use Elentra and how to navigate this visualization platform, I encourage you to do so. And Jim and I would be happy to help you to sort of navigate this, and I'm sure Andrea would be happy as well. Step number 6 is to set your agenda. Again, when you're deciding which residents are going to be reviewed at a particular meeting, Remember that residents need to be reviewed a minimum of twice per year. They should be reviewed prior to a stage transition, and there may be some ad hoc meetings that are necessary for timely resident issues. This is our meeting schedule for the Department of Emergency Medicine. So we've been intentional about scheduling our reviews at transition points. So for example, our transition to discipline is 3 blocks in duration. And so you can see that we have a mid stage meeting and then an end of stage meeting, just to make sure that our residents are on track. And of course, we've got a meeting at the end of their PGY 5-year in June to officially sign them off. So you'll see that we're quite intentional, and residents are reviewed approximately every 6 months by default. Once you've identified which residents are going to be reviewed at your meeting, the next step is to assign a primary reviewer, and their role really is to perform an in-depth review of the residents' data. Primary reviewers can be assigned in different ways. So some programs have chosen to assign a primary reviewer longitudinally, so they stay with that resident through their 5 years or 1 year or 2 year of their fellowship program. Some programs have opted to assign primary reviewers based on specific competencies or specific stages of training. And you'll just need to figure out what works and what makes more sense for your program. And the last step into the meeting is for the primary reviewer to do their homework. And that's really to do an in-depth review of the available assessment data, to benchmark the residents' data against the national guidelines and their existing learning plan, and to come up with a proposed status for that resident. So I'll just pause there briefly before we go into what happens at the meeting to see if there are any questions or comments. So I see a question here from Catherine. Question on the timing of CC meetings and RTC, RPC meetings. We may have issue in scheduling our CC meetings close to our RTC meetings, given when our in-training exams such as OSCEs occur that we use as data. Question, can the competence recommend that a resident move from one stage of the competence continuum to the next and allow that resident to do so before RTC ratification? Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that if you're a purist, probably not. These decisions really should be ratified by the RPC before that's communicated to the resident and before sort of an action happens. Having said that, I'll be completely honest, in our program, we've had, especially early on, issues where the timing didn't work out and we promoted a resident prior to an RPC meeting. We did not anticipate that resident would have any, that the RPC would disagree with our competence committee decision. And so we made that choice to promote them in advance of the ratification, sort of knowing that the RPC would likely ratify it. Does that help, Catherine? Okay, perfect. Okay, so not seeing any other questions, I think we will continue. Unless Jim, do you have any comments on Catherine's question?
No, not really. I mean, I think everything's sort of real world anyway. So I think the ratification stage probably is more significant for a resident that the Competence Committee deems, possibly requiring some remediation. Whereas, most of the residents they'll transition through almost sort of rubber stamped based on the recommendations from the CC, and recognizing also that the stages are a little bit arbitrary in the fact that a lot of the residents will be, quote unquote, in one stage, but they will still potentially be, acquiring EPAs in a higher stage a lot of the time. So.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Okay, so we'll move on to what happens at the meeting. So at the meeting, the Competence Committee chair will, open up the committee, ask for any initial comments or questions. We'll approve the agenda, remind members of confidentiality. Something that we've started to do at our Competence Committee is just check for any perceived conflicts of interest. So if one of the members, for example, is either a mentor to one of the residents, they may just declare that up front, just so that everything is transparent at the committee. And then the chair will invite one of the primary reviewers to present their resident. And this is where the primary reviewer presents a summary of the portfolio and proposes a recommendation on the learner status. So they might say, I reviewed Jane Doe, who's currently in Foundations of Training, and then go ahead and sort of provide a summary of that resident's data. That can be either in a form of a handout, or projected on a screen. And it's helpful to actually have a Lentra and your 145 available, whether that's individual laptops or a big screen, so that the members can really dive into the data and look at what the primary reviewer is discussing. And then the primary reviewer kind of end off by proposing a recommendation. So I recommend a modified learning plan for her, et cetera, et cetera. And again, here's our new Elentra visualization tool. And you can see when you hover over a data point, you can immediately get information about the narrative from that EPA. And so having this visualization tool open at your meetings can be very helpful for quickly reviewing the data and looking at trends. In terms of roles, the other CC members really kind of serve as the jury. They're there to consider the evidence that's being provided by the primary reviewer, to look at that evidence relative to the national guidelines, to ask questions and clarify, to identify gaps, to question or look in more detail at outlying data. And the Competence Committee chair is there to facilitate the discussion, to ensure that there's a fair and transparent process, and then ultimately to rally members to come to a decision, whether that be through consensus or through a vote that would be outlined in your processes and procedures document. The program director can provide some important insights. So for example, if the committee identifies that there's a resident who is perhaps lacking some data, or there seems to be a big gap in their data, the program director might chime in and say, well, actually that resident has been on leave for XYZ reason, and that's why there's no data. And so providing some context to the assessment data available for a particular resident. In terms of the program administrator, they'll play different roles depending on your program and the size of your program. Tasks might include data processing and collating to produce reports, as well as meeting administration. We have tried to protect our PA from the data processing and collating, because that can be quite burdensome. And so our PA Lees primarily focuses on meeting administration, scheduling, recording minutes, coordinating follow-up meetings with our residents, etc. So what is the authority of the Competence Committee? So the Competence Committee can make decisions about EPA achievement, but they make recommendations about the learner's status and any associated learner actions. And a requirement by the college is that you use the terminology outlined by the college. And so this QR code will link to the website, which has all the specific terms to use for your Competence Committee. So For example, learner's status might include progressing as expected, not progressing as expected, accelerated in some rare circumstances. And then for each status, there's associated learner actions such as monitor their learning plan, modify the learning plan. They're ready to be promoted, ready for the exam, etc. An important piece from the accreditation side is this idea of documentation. So it's important that you record evidence and a rationale for EPA achievement and promotion recommendations. Different programs have opted to do this in different forms. Some have chosen to do this in the meeting minutes. In our program, we've done this as part of their resident report. So the primary reviewer will draft a report that is ultimately sort of finalized at the Competence Committee meeting, and once ratified by the RPC, this resident report is actually sent to the resident so that it's very clear to them how the Competence Committee came to the decision in areas where they're really excelling and areas where they need to improve on. So just in that spirit of transparency, we've opted to document the rationale in this way. In terms of next steps or after the meeting, as I mentioned, you'll need to bring forward any recommendations to the RPC for ratification. And once ratified, this is recorded in their portfolio. And the last piece, which is oftentimes brushed over, is the feeding back to the trainee. And so we have academic coaches in our program. Smaller programs, it may be the PD who reports back to the resident about the outcome of the competence committee. But really, this is where the opportunity for coaching over time occurs. And if you're wondering what coaching over time is, there's a nice module created by some of my colleagues at the college about the value of coaching over time. So this idea of developing a therapeutic or educational alliance with your trainees and helping them through that CBD process, encouraging them to self-reflect through that process throughout their training. So we've covered a lot of information, but here's sort of the workflow of the competence committee. So for committees that are just starting up, the chair may be involved in selecting members, and ideally all members should be involved in developing your terms of reference and your process and procedures documents. Prior to meetings, that data needs to be aggregated and collated in a usable way. This requires a capable data management system. The primary reviewer will then have the important task of performing an in-depth review and synthesis of the data and bring that forward to the meeting where this data will be discussed and interpreted, and ultimately a decision or judgment will be made at the competence committee about the resident's progress, which then is ratified and then communicated to the relevant stakeholders, in particular the trainee. So the last thing that I want to touch on is the role of the competence committee in a process of CQI. So the committee is really uniquely positioned to monitor and evaluate the implementation of CBD, as well as the implementation of your new program of assessment. And so, the competence committee may be involved in providing feedback about the EPA design to specialty committees. We've heard that that some programs are really struggling to use their EPAs in a practical way, and so that information can be fed back to your relevant specialty committee to see if EPAs can be modified. And certainly in our program, we've gone through a couple of rounds of very minor tweaks for specific EPAs. The competence committee also has a role in improving the assessment system. So, changing the forms that are being used, the timing of assessments may be modified. Lots of opportunities to see where there may be gaps in your assessment system, or perhaps even redundancies. And of course, the Competence Committee can play an important role in informing faculty development and assessor training. So at the end of the meetings, it's always helpful to kind of reflect, did the members have the right data? Was there sufficient data to make decisions, and what was the quality of the data that they reviewed? And through that process of reflection, changes can be identified for your program. So I just want to leave you with two additional resources. This QR code will link to the Competence Committee technical guide, which really outlines the fundamental elements required for each programs and the expectations of the Competence Committee, but it also outlines where there's flexibility. So, on some of our Competence Committee chairs forum, we've heard people say, well, I've heard that we're supposed to do this, but is there any flexibility in how that is implemented? And this technical guide will really provide you the answers to those questions. This last resource, this QR code will link to a series of mock resident cases that as a committee you can go through together and just kind of simulate what a Competence Committee meeting would look like. This is especially useful for those programs who have not yet had a meeting. Just to iron out some of the kinks and the processes before your first meeting. And it uses mock data, and it has a sort of a guide for you to walk through and see how a decision might be made by your Competence Committee based on the available data. And I think with that, we can take some questions now, if there are any. Not seeing any questions. So then I'll hand it over to Jim, who will go through some of the sort of practical tips and forms that you might use with your Competence Committee.
Great. Thanks, Warren. Just share my screen here. Everyone okay to see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Great. So again, just wanted to go through some of the workflows that we've developed in the Department of Surgery. Again, as stated initially, my first experiences with CBD were back in probably about 2016 as the past program director for urology and being involved at the specialty committee level when we were starting to obviously develop CBD for urology. And then in 2017, assuming the role as vice chair of education for the Department of Surgery, and really looking at ways to standardize and help our surgical programs roll out. So Christine Seabrook and myself, as well as a lot of the PAs, have really been sort of tweaking these processes for the last sort of 5 years. And I think that's hopefully today we'll be able to provide you with some sort of, I guess, templates and sort of practical approaches that you can certainly look at. I would certainly encourage the various Comps Committee chairs and PDs to talk to other programs and see what they're doing. I think that's a big part of finding the processes that work well for your individual program. I have no disclosures. I wanted to put this slide in here. This is a slide that Christine and I sort of put together several years ago when we started to think about, what is actually required for success for a resident in CBD, and understanding that the resident really is the center point, but surrounded by all these various supporting aspects, and really again looking at what are the requirements to help a resident achieve success, looking at again standardized approaches, curating resources, finding those resources that actually are helpful. There's a huge volume of resources at the Royal College, and trying to pull out the resources that had a lot of, I guess, a lot of teeth to them. Administrative support is crucial. It's wonderful to see so many PAs on the chat today as well. As I stated, sharing best practices and talking to your various other program directors and CC chairs is key. Warren alluded to it as well, that you do need to have engaged faculty at the Competence Committee level, and hopefully throughout your program as well. The functioning e-portfolio was crucial. This was one of our biggest stumbling blocks when we started, and I'll talk to a little bit about that. So, and again, it's an ongoing process. I think that's important to note, that you will tweak it as you go along in this journey. So my approach to, I guess, my role as program director previously and vice chair was really looking at the practical implementation of CBD. What do you actually do when you get into that room with your Competence Committee members? Warren sort of obviously chatted about this, but there's a certain flow that's required as you move through that process of resident assessment. Each program will have to reflect on what they want to include in that review of a resident. And again, this requires a review of your assessment data and what you would like to include in that. So it's not just a review of the EPAs and milestones, but also those specialty or program specific metrics that you also like to look at, whether it's in-training examinations, other examinations, and end of rotation evaluations, etc. Again, sort of thinking about the workflow is crucial, I think, and it's important that the Competence Committee workflow is a multi-staged workflow that does require preparation prior to a CC meeting. You can't just sort of show up and wing it. The CC meeting itself does require time. So again, ensuring that you give it an adequate amount of time, not sort of trying to squeeze a meeting in before running off to the operating room, trying to sort of squeeze a meeting in prior to an RTC meeting. This process does require time and energy and thought. Following the CC meeting, of course, the resident evaluations need to be sort of discussed at some level and some length at the RPC meeting, especially for the residents that do require a little bit more of an in-depth review, or possibly development of IEPs, etc. And then, as Warren alluded to as well, that information does need to be fed back to the resident to sort of close the loop. Some of the challenges that we sort of faced in the Department of Surgery, and again from my own experience as the first surgical program urology to embark on CBD, is that a lot of the workflows were really sort of generated without really any practical experience, both at the Royal College level as well as at the postgrad level. So it has been an iterative process. Again, deficiencies in the Elantra electronic platform led to these initial workflows being developed, and with improvements in Elantra, it has allowed us to improve our own workflows. And again, we do still have I think very much a problem with being siloed, within our own university as well as between universities. We're hoping to try to sort of address that, I think, locally as well as at the Royal College level. Again, just to reflect on what the initial workflow for us was using forms in Office 365, really to sort of tally EPA data. This was, again, one of the biggest challenges that we faced with Elantra, is that it really did not provide us with an ability to report on the data. It was easy to input it at the work-based assessment stage, but to actually try to pull the data was extremely onerous and challenging. So we spent a lot of the time And really I think in the earlier stages of competent committees, this was really more of an accounting exercise. So again, looking at trying to improve these inefficiencies has really been the source of our ongoing iterative process. Early on, again, we had, just to sort of show you, again, a little bit of a journey and history of what we've been through. The primary review consisted, again, of taking that tallied data from the primary reviewers, putting them into quite an extensive, exhaustive spreadsheet by the PAs, and then looking at this at the competency committee level. So it was really, really inefficient. Secondary metrics we still use, and I think it's a nice way to keep your data, in a area and in a place in the residence file that can be easily looked at, and also is nice for come accreditation time as well. So we still use the sort of the secondary metrics spreadsheet that's populated throughout the year, following each of the individual assessments. So really the goals for improvement over the years have really been to try to develop standardized CC workflows. Our approach in the Department of Surgery is that we have 10 different programs supported by our administrative staff and various program administrators. And if we could come up with a standardized workflow, then it made the heavy lifting, easier for those later programs. So urology was sort of the pilot, and has continued to be the sort of the pilot program, and any real changes have been, shared with the subsequent programs that have been onboarded. Trying to reduce duplication, improve efficiencies, both at the primary reviewer level, efficiencies for PAs, the CC process, and finally the generation of the RPC report, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. This has really been, we've been able to do this based on, again, some of the improvements in the Elantra visualization dashboard, which again, I've got a nice little video at the end that I can show. So some of these CBD enhancements that we've really focused on, and some of the practical things that have helped us out, design of a fillable form that can follow the process through the pre-CC primary review, at the CC meeting where we complete the report, and then that report can be shared on to the RPC. Faculty development is crucial, so coming up with ways to help guide our primary reviewers through this process. I'll speak a little bit about some of the enhancements in the visualization dashboards, both for resident, faculty, and program evaluation. We've continued to look at implementation of EPA standards. I think that's important to be aware of, that we do need to have a certain number of completed EPAs in order to do justice to that resident review. And if there's not enough EPAs being captured, then we're really unable to assess the resident in sufficient fashion. So the generic ITR, we've gone back to a genericized CanMeds-based ITAR, or end of training, assessment form. We feel that again, the evaluation of the CanMeds roles, we wanted to explicitly allow rotation supervisors to comment on those roles, as right now they're buried deep within the milestones, and so this is something which I can share with you as well. And lastly, for programs that have procedures and practical or hands-on procedures, there is now a logbook feature in Elantra that I would encourage you to look at. It's not perfect, but it's certainly it's better than the start of Elantra. There was no logbook functionality. So again, speaking to just practical processes, and it starts from that first email that comes out to the primary reviewers. This is Isabel Menard. It's her work here as well. And a lot of thought has been put into this by Isabel, Christine, looking at how to actually, connect with the primary reviewer. So this is a standardized email that goes out to each of the reviewers prior to a CC meeting. There are links to Elantra for those that still have troubles finding Elantra. There are links to each of the individual resident assessment folders to allow that primary reviewer a quick access into the each of the resident folders. The one of our more recent updates is this fillable form. Again, it's been designed to follow the process. And again, it starts with an initial fill-in by the, let me see if I can get this up here. It should link to something. No. Apologies. There we go. So one of the things we struggled with was, again, filling out a form and trying to reduce the duplications, having your PA conduct and capture minutes while discussions were happening. So this form is what we've developed, and again, we're happy to share. It's just one option. So again, I think it'll be up to the individual programs to sort of see what's out there and see if there are templates and other workflows that work for you. This is just one example. So as I sort of walk you through this, we can fill in, it's a drop-down menu. You can fill in, your resident, what level of training they're in, etc. We usually start by having the PAs fill the first two fields in, bringing forward the actions and recommendations from the last CC report, and then also filling in rotations that have been completed by the residents since the last meeting. This form is then sent to the primary reviewer. And as I said, the form has really been, developed to really try to make it as easy as possible. So again, with specific directions embedded in the actual form, and again with some guidance as to what we feel are, standards, at least within the Department of Surgery. Options to obviously fill in comments, etc. And I'm going to speak to some of these various fields and so forth with a video walkthrough at the end of the talk. So the initial EPA review does require obviously going through each of the stages. Now, if a resident has already achieved, we just basically will bypass this. But it does require, again, reflection on each of the EPAs by the primary reviewer to determine whether, again, it's been either previously achieved, whether there's no evidence of any progress for an EPA, whether an EPA is in progress, or whether the primary reviewer feels that this is now an EPA that can be signed off. Once the primary review has been done and the EPA review has been completed, the primary reviewer then looks at the secondary metrics, or the e-portfolio review. For us, it's broken down again into the ITAR, end of training, again looking to ensure that there were no concerns with any of the various CanMeds roles. If there are specialty-specific examinations that need to be reviewed, again, this is also an opportunity to look at that data. This is a bit of a placeholder. We're hoping to start to include a little bit of a resident self-reflection prior to each composite committee to allow the resident an opportunity to be part or more of the process itself. Surgical logbook review, etc. The form then, once it's completed, at the CC meeting, this form is opened up. This can be obviously captured by either the PA in real time. In urology, I sort of fulfill this role as composite committee chair, such that the review is captured in real time. Learner is determined whether they're on or off trajectory. reasons for off trajectory, and then, as Warren alluded to, using the Royal College various um, um, status recommendations and learner actions as per the Royal College. The Competence Committee can actually put together their thoughts as to what they feel would be helpful in terms of action plans, but realizing that and recognizing that it's up to the RPC to develop that plan officially. And then for us, it's again a decision as to how to inform that resident. This is something I think that Andrea was going to share with people today, and they can have a look at it. Moving on to some of the improvements in the visualization dashboards. There are resident dashboards that again are tied into the rotation schedule. I think I'm going to leave a lot of this to a little video walkthrough. I've got a little 4-minute video walkthrough that I can show it to you in real time. But understanding that there are these new resident visualization dashboards, excuse me, as well as faculty and program evaluation dashboards. So being familiarized with them, I think certainly as a program director, a PA, and a CC chair, you should be a lot more familiar with the functionality in Elantra. The faculty evaluation, so reports can be generated within Elantra that can also be helpful to feedback to the various staff. This is something that Isabel just sent out to us. We basically are sending this out to all of the faculty members such that they can look at the number of assessments that they've completed. It can be helpful for, again, improvement and faculty involvement in the actual CBT process. Reports can also be generated looking at the average time to complete an EPA. So if there's ever any pushback from your faculty about it taking too long, as you can see here, that the actual time to fill out an EPA is quite minimal. Again, there are program evaluation dashboards available now where you can actually track each color basically represents a different year. And so you can actually see trends of EPA assessments year over year. We have felt that it's important in the Department of Surgery to set standards. Early on, a lot of our residents in urology were off trajectory, not because they were bad residents, just they were not collecting their required number of EPAs that would allow us to do a comprehensive assessment. So based on reflection, based on discussions with other CC chairs at some of the webinars that have been held over the last 18 months, I think that there are certain standards that I think that programs are implementing. Depends on the culture, of course, of your program. Anesthesia and emergency medicine, it's built into their culture of getting an assessment after every shift or every day in the operating room. So I think it's important to reflect on that and consider setting standards within your programs. We've also set stage-specific standards to help guide the residents as to where we expect them to be, depending on their stage. And I think this is important, again, to reflect on at a Competence Committee level. Again, just an example, this is our updated ITAR for the Department of Surgery that we're using. And again, it's exploded out into the various CanMeds roles. We feel that it's important to allow that end of rotation assessment. And with a genericized form, the real benefit is that an aggregate report can be put together quite easily by the program administrator and be included in the resident assessment folder for the primary reviewer to look at. And as you can see, it does generate an aggregate report. So one can look at, the how the resident's doing on an aggregate report. Elantra does have a logbook feature that's now accessible and can be looking at your own sort of state-specific procedures that you're hoping your residents will have exposure to. So some of the practical tips for competency committees, again, in the Department of Surgery, workflows are typically supported by two members, so a program administrator, and Christine Seabrook does sit on a lot of these competency committees, really as sort of a quality assurance piece to help our program directors and competency committees really try to achieve those standards that we're trying to achieve. It is important to visualize and sort of think about your processes and almost have these dry runs. The primary reviewer, it does require, that time and effort. So, it's important that the form or however you're going to, conduct your process, but there's time for that primary reviewer to complete it, and trying to provide that faculty development piece to encourage your primary reviewers to spend the appropriate amount of time doing the resident review. So I think this is, again, ties into, having those members on your competency committee that are certainly engaged and committed to the process. We've talked about EPA completions and setting standards. Workflow, again, don't get too discouraged. It is a work in progress, basically, and each competency committee meeting will run better and better each time you do it. Some of the resources that are out there, again, for the new program directors, Program Directors Handbook is a great resource. I would certainly encourage you to read through it. Christine, myself, and Dr. Nake put a couple of chapters there for the new program directors, as well as CBD and CanMeds, some of the practical aspects of change. So, and then we actually have we developed a CBD manual, Christine and myself, that's out there on Apple iBooks. People are certainly encouraged to have a look at it if you feel it might be helpful to you. So I have one video if it's okay to show it to you. It's a 4-minute run through. I put this together yesterday, really just sort of walking primary reviewer through the Elantra, helping to sort of guide that process. And this is, again, one of the things that I certainly struggled with early on is, how do you actually navigate through Elantra? There's a lot of different tabs there, and I think that anything we can do to help further that process and help to guide, I think is very, very helpful. So I'll just let this play, and we can then open it up to questions.
Just gonna ask, I don't hear any audio. Does anybody else hear audio?
No audio?
No.
Okay. I can maybe just do a voiceover if that's okay.
Sounds good.
I can do that too. Okay, I'll just back it up again. And again, the video is obviously available for anyone as well. And again, it's just one option. Again, the struggles we had was how to actually practically do this. So, okay, let me just let it play and I'll sort of talk over it. So again, logging into Elantra, making sure that your faculty members know how to get into Elantra. What you previously used for score, using the same passwords. First is the assessments and evaluation tab, top right. This gets you into where you need to be for looking at the various assessments, and then selecting your My Learners tab. This sort of brings up the older color-coded dashboard and the logbook access point. So this was not even available when we started. You can have a quick little look through each of your residents' progress through the various stages. The different colors basically denote progress through each of the various EPAs. Clicking on the dashboard or logbook. So this dashboard tab, again, brings us to the sort of the original setup in Elantra, where each of the EPAs are listed within the various stages. You can see the progress moving down the right-hand side, what's been checked off and been achieved. During the primary review, again, this is where we're looking to see whether or not an EPA can be checked off. Down the left side, you're seeing the various color codes to progress within the individual EPAs. You can explode out each of the EPAs if you want to look at the specific evaluations separately, or an aggregate sort of reporting of the various assessments for the individual EPA. So this is sort of the older version. Going back, top right corner, get you back into the assessments and evaluation screen. Again, once again, selecting on My Learners. And this is sort of the new area. So there's a visual summary tab now. If you click on that, that actually brings us into the new visualization dashboard functionality. So there's a few different tabs here. So we have resident metrics, normative assessment, faculty development, and then program evaluation. So I usually start by looking at a normative assessment and then setting the stage that the resident's in. So foundations, this brings up the residents that are actually in foundations. And I really just sort of look at how they compare to their PGY year, looking at their totals, percentages, and so forth. And I'm really looking to see if there are any outliers. And then go into the specific resident assessment by clicking on the resident metrics and selecting out your resident. And then clicking on the Get Records tab. At this point in time, you now have these new dashboards. First thing I look at is the rotation schedule. I expand it up to view the history and the EPAs per block. And this speaks to, again, setting standards. A block turns green after only 5, which I think is, again, quite low. So again, you can sort of see how the residents pursuing their EPAs, we can use this to give them a nudge. Acquisition metrics look at gain EPAs per week. So you can sort of see whether or not there's been a flat line or whether there's signs of life. Recent EPAs, for us in urology, we have EPAs that are out of 2, as well as EPAs that are marked out of 5. Hence, it's sort of a blended graph. And as Warren alluded to, hovering over each of the points and actually bring up a snapshot of the assessment. This is now where we can go through each of the individual EPAs are now presented in a nice graphical representation. You're looking at the various stages. In this case, this resident's already down to their core. You can look at their progress within core. Each of the EPAs, we can look at trends with their EPA assessments, as well as where they are at. We sort of look at this data and say, okay, well, for a PGY3, they should have most of their clinical EPAs completed. You can also expand out, again, the individual assessments. It's presented quite nicely, looking at contextual variables, comments, etc. So it allows us, I think, instead of just a tallying exercise, allows us to really have more of a higher level review of a resident and more comprehensive review. So I think I'm going to end it there. I do have, for people, if they are interested, an example of how a resident sort of presented at our competency committee, but I can hold that for now. Let me see if I can stop sharing. So just to summarize, it's been a journey for sure, and we're constantly trying to tweak it. For us, it was really looking at those practical aspects. That's what I really struggled with. The theory, I get it, but how to actually do what we're tasked to do? How do we actually carry out these processes? And that's where a lot of our focus has been in the Department of Surgery, to give our program directors, our competency committee chairs, and the various CC members some practical tools that they can use to implement CBD. Any questions? Easy peasy. Andrea, you still there?
I am. I don't see anything in the chat. I was just trying to see if anybody was going to be typing.
I wonder if my screen froze 5 minutes ago. So
no, you're good.
Okay.
Okay. Well, if there are no questions, everybody can have some time back, but I just wanted to thank Dr. Watterson and Dr. Cheung. This was super helpful and I think very informative for everybody. Of course, if there's any questions that come up after the session, please feel free to email myself, or I'm sure Dr. Watterson and Dr. Cheung are open to questions as well via email. I am just going to put my email address in the chat just in case anybody doesn't have it. Always here to help, so just let us know. Yeah, that's great. And again, Christine is available through the Office of Education as well. We're happy to support any of the programs that are coming online as well.